The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists began gathering for the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd, a group of 5 Asian tourists chatted excitedly in their native language, cameras ready to capture every moment of their London adventure. Li Wei, a businessman from Shanghai, led the group with his wife Mei and their teenage daughter Xiaoli. Accompanying them were Li Wei's younger brother Chen and his girlfriend Yuki, who was visiting from Japan. They had planned this European vacation for months, and London was their first stop. "Look at those funny hats," Xiaoli giggled, pointing at the iconic bearskin caps worn by the Queen's Guard. "They look like giant black mops." The group laughed as they positioned themselves near the palace gates, jostling with other tourists for the best viewing spots. Li Wei had his expensive camera ready, determined to get photos that would make his colleagues back home jealous. As the ceremony began, the guards marched in perfect formation, their red tunics bright against the gray London morning. Their faces remained completely expressionless, eyes staring straight ahead as they performed their centuries-old ritual with military precision. "They look like robots," Chen whispered loudly to Yuki, not caring if anyone understood. "Do you think they're even real people under those ridiculous costumes?" Yuki giggled and pulled out her phone to record a video. "Let's see if we can make them laugh or break character," she suggested mischievously. "This will be so funny to show our friends back home." The idea sparked immediate enthusiasm in the group. What started as innocent tourist curiosity quickly transformed into something more disrespectful. Li Wei began making exaggerated facial expressions and waving dramatically at the nearest guard. A young man who couldn't have been more than 25 years old, the guard, whose name was James Thompson, had been serving in the Queen's Guard. For 3 years, he had experienced countless attempts by tourists to break his concentration, but he maintained his professional composure as always. His training had prepared him for exactly these situations. Mei joined in the antics, making silly faces and trying to get into the guard's line of sight. "Look, he's trying so hard not to smile," she said in Mandarin, loud enough for nearby tourists to hear and understand her mocking tone through her gestures. Other visitors began to notice the commotion. Some looked uncomfortable with the group's behavior, while others seemed amused by the spectacle. A British family standing nearby exchanged disapproving glances, but said nothing, not wanting to create an international incident. Xiaoli decided to escalate things further. She approached the guard more closely than the barriers allowed and began making monkey-like gestures, jumping up and down while making faces. "Maybe if I act like a monkey, he'll react," she announced in English, drawing more attention from the crowd. The guard, James, felt his jaw tighten slightly, but years of training kept his expression neutral. Inside, however, he was growing increasingly frustrated. These tourists had no idea of the honor and tradition they were mocking. His grandfather had served in the same regiment during World War II, and James took immense pride in continuing that legacy. Chen pulled out his phone and started live streaming the entire incident on social media. "Watch us make these British guards break," he narrated to his online audience. "They think they're so serious and important, but they're just dressed-up entertainers for tourists like us." The livestream began attracting viewers with comments pouring in, encouraging the group to be even more outrageous. The validation from strangers online emboldened them further, and they began competing with each other to come up with the most ridiculous behaviors. Li Wei decided to try a different approach. He began loudly discussing the guards in English, making disparaging comments about British culture and military traditions. "These people live in the past," he declared. "In China, we focus on the future, not playing dress-up like children." Comments stung not just James, but several other guards within earshot. These men had dedicated their lives to serving their country, and many had seen active duty in Afghanistan and other conflict zones before joining the ceremonial unit. They weren't just playing dress-up, they were highly trained soldiers, performing an important cultural duty. As the group's behavior became more disruptive, other tourists began moving away from them. An elderly British veteran, wearing his military medals on his jacket, looked particularly disturbed by the display. He had served alongside the Queen's Guard during his own military career and understood the discipline and sacrifice these young men represented. The family from Germany, who had been standing nearby, finally decided to speak up. "Excuse me," the father said politely to Li Wei, "but this is quite disrespectful. These guards are serving their country." Li Wei laughed dismissively. "It's just a show for tourists," he replied. "If they can't handle a little fun, maybe they should get real jobs." The German tourist shook his head and walked away with his family, muttering about the decline of common courtesy. More people in the crowd began to notice the disturbance, and whispers spread about the group's inappropriate behavior. Meanwhile, James continued to stand at attention, his training overriding his personal feelings. But something inside him was building, not anger exactly, but a deep sense of disappointment in how these visitors were treating something he held sacred. Unknown to the group of tourists, their live stream was being watched by thousands of people, including several who recognized the location and were taking screenshots of their faces. The internet has a long memory, and their behavior was being documented in real time by strangers around the world. UKI noticed more people watching them and felt a thrill of excitement. "We're becoming famous," she told Chen. "Look how many people are paying attention to us now." But not all attention is good attention, as they would soon discover. Among the crowd were several local Londoners who worked near the palace and passed by the ceremony regularly. They had seen disrespectful tourists before, but this group was particularly brazen in their mockery. One of these locals, Sarah Mitchell, was a journalist for a London newspaper. She had stopped by during her lunch break to enjoy the familiar ceremony, but found herself documenting something entirely different. She began taking notes and photos, her journalist instincts kicking in as she witnessed what she considered a perfect example of tourist behavior gone wrong. The ceremony continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. What should have been a dignified display of British tradition had become a spectacle centered around the disruptive tourists. The other visitors seemed divided between those who were entertained and those who were genuinely offended. As the group prepared for even more outrageous behavior, none of them realized that their actions were about to set in motion a series of events that would teach them a lesson they would never forget. The wheels of karma were already beginning to turn, and the consequences of their disrespect would prove to be far more significant than they could have imagined. James stood motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead, but his mind was processing everything that was happening around him. Little did the tourists know, but this particular guard had connections and resources that would soon come into play in ways they'd never expected. While the group enjoyed their lunch at a trendy cafe near Covent Garden, completely oblivious to the storm brewing around them, James Thompson was having a very different kind of meal. He sat in the guardsmen's mess hall, sharing the morning's events with his fellow soldiers. The worst part wasn't the mockery, James explained to his closest friend, Corporal Sarah Hughes. It was how they treated that elderly woman who tried to ask them politely to stop. They showed no human decency at all. Sarah nodded sympathetically. She had seen the tail end of the incident and was equally disturbed. "What are you thinking of doing about it?" she asked, knowing James well enough to recognize that look in his eyes. "Nothing vindictive," James replied thoughtfully. "But I think they need to understand what real service means. They think we're just tourist attractions, but they have no idea who we really are or what we've done." Unknown to James, his idea was about to get support from an unexpected source. Sarah Mitchell, the journalist who had witnessed everything, was already working on a story for the London Evening Standard. But she wasn't just writing about rude tourists, she was investigating the background of the guard who had been targeted. Her research revealed that James Thompson was far from just a ceremonial soldier. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan with distinction, earning a military cross for valor after saving 3 wounded comrades under enemy fire. He had joined the Queen's Guard not because he couldn't find real work, but because he wanted to serve his country in a different way after losing several close friends in combat. Meanwhile, back at the cafe, Li Wei was basking in the attention their video was receiving online. "Look," he told his family, showing them his phone screen. "Over 10,000 views already, and it's only been 2 hours. What he wasn't showing them were the comments, which had taken a decidedly negative turn. British viewers were sharing the video widely, but not in celebration. They were expressing outrage and demanding to know who these disrespectful tourists were. "Disgraceful behavior," wrote one commenter. "These guards are war heroes, not entertainment. Someone needs to identify these people and make sure they face consequences," wrote another. "As a veteran myself, this makes me sick," posted a third. "These soldiers have served in combat zones while these tourists mock them for views." The video was being shared across multiple platforms now, spreading far beyond its original audience. British military veterans were particularly vocal in their condemnation, sharing their own stories about the sacrifices made by guards like James. Chen's girlfriend Yuki was the first to notice something was wrong. While scrolling through social media during their meal, she came across their video being shared in a British Facebook group, but the comments were uniformly negative. "Chen," she said nervously, "I think people are angry about our video." Chen glanced at her phone and shrugged. "They're just jealous that we had the courage to have fun." British people are known for being uptight and boring. But Yuki's concern was growing as she read more comments. Some people were calling for the tourists to be identified and banned from future visits to royal sites. Others were sharing the video with travel authorities and British cultural organizations. At the same time, James Thompson was meeting with his regimental sergeant major, who had an interesting proposal. Thompson, the senior officer, said, "I've heard about this morning's incident. Normally, we'd just file a report and move on. But I think there's an opportunity here for something more educational." "What do you mean, sir?" James asked. "It turns out these tourists are staying at the Savoy Hotel. They've booked a private tour of the Tower of London tomorrow, thinking they'll get VIP treatment. What they don't know is that our regiment provides historical interpretation services. For special tours." James began to understand where this was heading, and a small smile crossed his face for the first time that day. "I'm assigning you to lead their tour, Thompson." In civilian clothes, of course. "They have no idea who you are or what you've done. I think it might be ... educational. For them to learn about real British military history from someone who's actually lived it." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. James would guide their tours as a knowledgeable historian, gradually revealing the true stories behind the traditions they had mocked. By the end, they would understand exactly who they had been disrespecting. Back at the cafe, the group's mood was finally beginning to shift as more negative feedback reached them. Shaoli showed her parents a comment thread where someone had translated their Chinese conversations from the video. "They understood what we were saying," she said worriedly. "Someone translated our comments about British culture," Li Wei read the translations and felt a moment of unease. Seeing their words written out in English made them seem harsher than he had intended, but his pride wouldn't let him admit concern. "So what?" he said defensively. "We have freedom of speech." "We weren't doing anything illegal." May, however, was beginning to have second thoughts. As a mother, she was starting to realize that their behavior might have been more inappropriate than funny. "Maybe we should delete the video," she suggested. Quietly. "Absolutely not," Chen protested. "We're not backing down because some people can't take a joke. Tomorrow we're touring the Tower of London, and if we get good content there, it'll make people forget about today." What none of them knew was that tomorrow's tour would indeed be unforgettable, but not in the way they expected. James Thompson was already preparing for what might be the most important historical education he had ever provided. As evening fell over London, the video continued spreading across social media platforms, gaining attention from military families, veterans, and cultural preservation groups. The tourists went to sleep that night, still celebrating their viral fame, completely unaware that they had just experienced the calm before a very educational storm. The next morning arrived crisp and clear, London's historic Tower Bridge visible in the distance as the group prepared for their exclusive Tower of London tour. They had booked the premium experience, expecting VIP treatment and perfect photo opportunities for their social media accounts. Li Wei checked his phone while getting dressed and was surprised to see their video from yesterday had reached over 50,000 views. "We're practically celebrities now," he announced to his family. Today's tour content will be even better. What he still hadn't done was read the comments carefully. If he had, he would have discovered that their fame was entirely the wrong kind. Military veteran groups across the UK had picked up the story, and several news outlets were now reporting on the incident as an example of disrespectful tourist behavior. At precisely 10 o'clock, they arrived at the Tower of London's private entrance, where they were greeted by a tall, well-dressed man in his late 20s. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit and carried himself with quiet confidence. "Good morning," the man said with a warm smile. "I'm James Harrison, your private tour guide today. I specialize in military history and the stories behind these ancient walls." The tourists had no idea they were looking at the same guard they had mocked yesterday. Out of uniform and in civilian clothes, James looked like a completely different person, educated, professional, and sophisticated. "This is more like it," Li Wei said approvingly in Mandarin to his family. "A proper tour guide who knows how to treat paying customers." James understood every word, having studied Mandarin during his military intelligence training, but he gave no indication of his comprehension. Instead, he began the tour with genuine enthusiasm for the history he was about to share. The Tower of London has served many purposes over its 1,000-year history, James began as he led them through the entrance. It's been a royal palace, a prison, a treasury, and most importantly for our purposes today, a military fortress that has seen some of the most significant moments in British military history. The group followed him, cameras ready, expecting the usual tourist-friendly presentation, but James had something much more substantial in mind. "Let me start by telling you about courage," he said, stopping at the first exhibit. "Real courage isn't about standing perfectly still while tourists try to make you laugh. It's about running toward danger when others run away." Yuki looked up from her phone, sensing something different in the guide's tone. There was an intensity there that seemed unusual for a typical tour. James led them to a display about the tower's role during World War II. "This fortress was bombed multiple times during the Blitz," he explained. "The guards here continued their duties even as explosions rocked the building. Some were killed at their posts, but others took their places immediately." He paused dramatically, letting the weight of his words sink in. These weren't actors or entertainers. They were soldiers who understood that some things are worth protecting, even at the cost of your own life. Chen was still filming everything, but something about the guide's passionate delivery was making him uncomfortable. This wasn't the light, touristy commentary he had expected. "Many people today don't understand military tradition," James continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "They see ceremonies and uniforms and think it's all just pageantry. They don't realize that every tradition represents real sacrifice by real people." May shifted nervously. The guide seemed to be speaking directly to them, though surely that was just coincidence. James led them deeper into the tower, to a section most tourists never see. "This is where we keep the records of every soldier who has served in the towers. Guard units," he explained, stopping in front of a wall covered with photographs and names. "Let me tell you about some recent heroes," he said, pointing to a photo of a young soldier in combat gear. "This is Private Michael Davies. He was killed in Afghanistan in 2018 while serving with the same regiment that provides guards for Buckingham Palace. He was 22 years old." The group fell silent, suddenly uncomfortable with the serious turn the tour had taken. James continued relentlessly. "And this is Sergeant Emma Thompson, no relation to me, just a coincidence in names. She lost both legs to an improvised explosive device while protecting a convoy of civilian aid workers. After her recovery, she requested assignment to ceremonial duties because she said it was an honor to represent fallen comrades." Shaoli stopped taking selfies and actually looked at the photographs James was showing them. For the first time, she was seeing the guards as real people with real stories, not just costumed performers. "The guards you see at Buckingham Palace," James said, his voice now carrying unmistakable authority, "are active duty soldiers. Many have served in combat zones. They volunteer for ceremonial duties because they understand the honor it represents." Li Wei was beginning to feel distinctly uncomfortable. Something about this guide's knowledge seemed too personal, too detailed for someone who had simply studied the subject academically. How do you know so much about specific soldiers? He asked suspiciously. James smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "'Cause I'm one of them," he said simply. "I served 2 tours in Afghanistan before requesting assignment to the Queen's Guard. Yesterday morning, I was the soldier you spent an hour trying to humiliate for your social media entertainment." The group stood frozen in shock, finally understanding. The magnitude of their mistake, the professional, articulate man standing before them, was the same person they had treated like a living statue. A curiosity to be mocked for online content. "You see," James continued calmly, "what you thought was a harmless joke was actually a deliberate attempt to humiliate someone who has risked his life for his country, someone who has lost friends in combat, someone who takes pride in representing something larger than himself." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time since arriving in London, the group of tourists had nothing to say. The revelation hung in the air like a physical weight. Li Wei's confident demeanor crumbled as he realized the full scope of their mistake. The professional tour guide standing before them was the very person they had spent an hour humiliating. For entertainment. Double quotes. Li Wei started, then stopped, unable to find words. For a successful businessman who prided himself on always knowing what to say, the silence was crushing. James continued the tour, but now every word carried deeper meaning. "Let me show you something else," he said, leading them to a memorial. "While these are the names of guards who died in service over the past decade, would you like to hear about them?" The group followed reluctantly. Their earlier enthusiasm completely evaporated. Yuki had stopped filming entirely, suddenly ashamed of her phone and the video that had seemed so entertaining just hours before. "This man," James said, pointing to a plaque, was Lance Corporal James Mitchell. He was killed by a roadside bomb while protecting a school in Helmand Province. He was supposed to start his ceremonial guard duties the week after he returned home. He never got the chance. Shaoli felt tears forming in her eyes as she looked at the photograph of a young soldier who looked barely older than herself. The reality of what James was telling them was starting to sink in. "His mother comes to watch the changing of the guard ceremony every month," James continued. "She says it helps her feel connected to her son's service. Yesterday she was in the crowd watching when you were making your jokes." May gasped softly, remembering the elderly woman who had pleaded with them to stop. The woman whose pain they had dismissed so callously. "That was her," James confirmed, seeing the recognition in May's eyes. "Mrs. Mitchell, she recognized you. From the video that's now spreading across the internet, she called my commanding officer last night, not to complain, but to ask if there was some way to help you understand what you had really done." The weight of their actions was becoming unbearable. Chen, who had been so proud of his livestream viewers, felt sick thinking about the thousands of people who would watch them mock a war hero. James led them to another section of the tower, where artifacts from various military campaigns were displayed. "These medals belong to guards who served in both world wars," he explained. "Men who stood at their posts during the London Blitz while bombs fell around them." He picked up a small frame containing a faded photograph. "This is my grandfather, Sergeant William Thompson. He served here during World War II. When the tower was bombed, he and his fellow guards refused to abandon their posts. 3 of his friends died that night, but they never left their positions." Li Wei stared at the photograph, seeing the family resemblance between the young soldier in the picture and their tour guide. The reality of military sacrifice was becoming personal and immediate in a way he had never experienced. "Your grandfather was a hero," May said softly, the first respectful words she had spoken since arriving in London. "He was," James agreed. "And so are the men you mocked yesterday. Each of them has earned the right to wear that uniform through service, sacrifice, and dedication to something greater than themselves." The tour continued, but the atmosphere had completely changed. Instead of tourists looking for entertainment, it had become students receiving a profound education about respect, service, and the true cost of freedom. James showed them letters written by guards to their families before deployment, photographs of ceremonial units at military funerals, and artifacts that told the stories of ordinary people who had done extraordinary things. "The stillness you mocked," James explained as they stood in the exact spot where Anne Boleyn had been executed, requires incredible mental discipline.
Oh.
It's not about being a statue or a robot. It's about showing respect for the traditions that thousands of people have died to protect. Yuki finally found her voice. "We didn't know," she said quietly. "We thought, ... we thought it was just a job, like acting or performance art." "I understand that," James replied, his tone gentler now. Different cultures have different ways of showing respect. But the internet doesn't care about cultural differences. Your video is being shared by military families around the world, and they all understand exactly what they saw. Chen looked at his phone and finally read the comments on their live stream for the first time. His face went pale as he scrolled through hundreds of messages condemning their behavior. "Oh no," he whispered. "This is really bad. Doesn't have to be the end of the story," James said thoughtfully. "You have a choice now. You can let this define you as the tourists who mocked war heroes. Or you can use this as an opportunity to learn something important about respect and service." The group exchanged glances, each of them processing the magnitude of their mistake in their own way. Li Wei, as the family patriarch, felt the responsibility most heavily. His decision to encourage the mockery had led them all into this situation. "What can we do?" he asked quietly. "How can we make this right?" James smiled for the first time since revealing his identity. "That's exactly the right question," he said, "and I have some ideas. But first, let me finish showing you what real courage looks like." He led them to the tower's chapel, where plaques commemorated guards who had died in service. "Every time we put on that uniform," James explained, "we're not just representing ourselves, we're representing every person who wore it before us and couldn't come home." The chapel was quiet except for the soft sound of May crying. The morning's arrogance had completely dissolved, replaced by a deep understanding of how wrong they had been. "I want to apologize," Li Wei said formally. "Not just to you, but to everyone we disrespected. We were ignorant and cruel, and theirs. No excuse for our behavior." James nodded approvingly. "Apologies are a good start," he said. "But actions matter more than words. Are you ready to learn what real honor looks like?" James looked at each member of the group carefully, assessing their sincerity. The transformation from arrogant tourists to genuinely remorseful people seemed complete. But he needed to be sure their change of heart was real. "Honor isn't just about apologizing when you get caught," he said seriously. "It's about doing the right thing, even when it's difficult or embarrassing. Are you prepared for that?" Li Wei nodded without hesitation. "Yes. Whatever it takes to make this right." James pulled out his phone and showed them the screen. Their video now had over 200,000 views, and news outlets were beginning to pick up the story. "Your behavior has become an international incident," he explained. "British military families are calling for you to be banned from the country. Veterans groups are demanding apologies. The Chinese embassy has been contacted by the Foreign Office." The group stared at the phone in horror. What had started as a fun video for their friends had spiraled completely out of control. "But," James continued, "Mrs. Mitchell, the woman you dismissed yesterday, she's given me an idea. Believes in redemption and second chances. She's willing to help you turn this around, if you're genuinely committed to making amends." Jolie wiped her eyes and looked up hopefully. "What would we need to do?" First, James said, "You need to create a proper apology video. Not just words, but actions that show you understand what you did wrong. You need to visit the military hospital, where wounded guards recover. You need to meet with veterans and hear their stories. You need to learn what service really means." Chen felt overwhelmed by the scope of what James was suggesting. "That sounds like it would take days," he said. "Your original plan was to spend a week touring Europe, making social media content," James pointed out. "I'm suggesting you spend that time learning something valuable instead. The question is whether your pride is more important than doing the right thing." May stepped forward. "We'll do it," she said firmly. "Whatever you think we should do to make this right." James smiled genuinely for the first time since revealing his identity. "Then let's start with Mrs. Mitchell. She's waiting in the tower's cafe. She wants to meet you properly." The walk to the cafe felt like the longest journey any of them had ever taken. Each step carried the weight of their shame and the hope of possible redemption. James led them to a corner table where an elderly woman sat with a cup of tea and a photograph in front of her. "It's Mrs. Mitchell," James said gently. "These are the tourists from yesterday." Margaret Mitchell looked up with eyes that held both sadness and surprising kindness. The photograph on the table was of a young soldier in dress uniform. Clearly her son Li Wei bowed deeply, a gesture of respect from his own culture. "Mrs. Mitchell, we are deeply sorry for our behavior yesterday. We had no idea who you were, or what your son had sacrificed." "Please sit down," she said softly. "I want to tell you about my James." For the next hour, Mrs. Mitchell shared stories about her son, his childhood dreams of serving his country, his pride in being selected for the ceremonial guard, his letters home from Afghanistan describing the honor he felt in representing British values. "He wrote to me once," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, about how the ceremonies weren't just for tourists. He said they were for everyone who couldn't come home. Every time he stood at attention, he was standing for his fallen friends. Yuki was crying openly now, understanding for the first time that the silly ceremony they had mocked was actually a sacred memorial for people like Mrs. Mitchell's son. "What can we do to honor his memory?" she asked through her tears. Mrs. Mitchell smiled through her own tears. "You can help people understand what you've learned. Your video went viral because people were angry. But imagine if a video about respect and understanding could go viral too." James nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what I was thinking. You have a platform now. Hundreds of thousands of people are watching. You can use that attention to teach others what you've learned today." Over the next several hours, with James and Mrs. Mitchell's guidance, the group planned their redemption campaign. They would spend the rest of their week in London learning about military service, visiting wounded veterans, and creating content that honored rather than mocked British traditions. Their first stop would be the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, where veteran pensioners lived. Then they would visit the rehabilitation center where wounded guards recovered from combat injuries. Finally, they would attend a private ceremony at Westminster Abbey where military families honored their fallen loved ones. "This isn't going to be easy," James warned them. "You'll meet people who've lost legs, arms, friends, family members. You'll hear stories that will change you permanently. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Li Wei looked around at his family, seeing their determined faces. "We created this problem with our ignorance," he said. "We need to fix it with education and respect." As they left the Tower of London that afternoon, the group was completely different from the one that had arrived that morning. They had learned that true strength comes not from mocking others, but from understanding and respecting the sacrifices that make freedom possible. Their journey from shame to redemption was just beginning. They now had guides who would help them navigate the path to genuine understanding and respect. 3 months later, Li Wei stood in front of his computer in Shanghai, putting the finishing touches on a documentary that would change his life forever. The video that had started as a source of shame had evolved into something beautiful, a powerful story of redemption, respect, and the true meaning of honor. The documentary, titled "Learning to See: A Journey from Disrespect to Understanding," had already been viewed over 5 million times across multiple platforms. But more importantly, it had sparked a global conversation about cultural respect and the real stories behind ceremonial traditions. The transformation had begun that very afternoon at the Tower of London, and the group had committed to their week of education. Their first visit to the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, had been overwhelming. They had met veterans from every major conflict of the past 50 years, each with stories that illustrated the true cost of freedom. Chen, who had been so eager to mock British traditions, found himself deeply moved by 89-year-old veteran Tom Bradley, who had served in Korea, the Falklands, and Northern Ireland. "Son," the old soldier had told him, "respect isn't about agreeing with everything. It's about understanding that other people's sacrifices matter, even if their culture is different from yours." At the rehabilitation center, they had met Sergeant Lisa Matthews, who had lost her right leg to an IED in Syria. She was learning to walk again so she could return to ceremonial duties. "The uniform means more to me now," she had explained. "Every step I take represents everyone who can't walk anymore. Yuki had been particularly affected by this meeting. She had started a fundraising campaign for the rehabilitation center that had raised over £50,000 for equipment and therapy programs. Her social media followers, initially attracted by entertainment content, had become passionate supporters of veteran causes. The most powerful moment of their week had come at Westminster Abbey, where they had attended a private memorial service. 4 guards killed in recent conflicts. Mrs. Mitchell had invited them to sit with military families as they remembered their loved ones. Lee had wept openly as the names were read aloud. Young men and women who had died serving their country. Many of them the same age as his daughter Shaoli. The ceremony was conducted with the same precision and dignity they had mocked at Buckingham Palace, but now they understood its profound meaning. Every movement has purpose, James had explained quietly. Every gesture represents centuries of tradition built on real sacrifice. What you saw as silly ceremony is actually the most solemn form of remembrance we have. The apology video they had created after that week had been unlike anything anyone expected. Instead of a simple "we're sorry" statement, they had produced a 20-minute documentary featuring their education journey. They interviewed veterans, shared the stories they had learned, and honestly documented their transformation from ignorant tourists to respectful advocates. The response had been overwhelming. British military families who had initially called for their punishment instead began praising their genuine commitment to learning and making amends. The Chinese embassy, which had been dealing with diplomatic embarrassment, proudly shared their story as an example of cultural bridge building. Most importantly, their story had inspired others. Tourism boards around the world began using their documentary and cultural sensitivity training. Their travelers who had made similar mistakes reached out for guidance on how to make meaningful amends. James Thompson had become more than just their teacher. He had become a friend. He visited China 6 months after their London encounter, where Li Wei's company had sponsored a military appreciation event featuring British and Chinese veterans sharing their experiences. "You taught me something too," James told Li Wei during that visit. "I learned that anger and punishment don't change hearts, but education and patience can create real understanding." The ripple effects continued to spread. Shaoli had changed her university major to international relations. Inspired by her experience to build bridges between cultures, Chen had started a non-profit organization focused on promoting respectful cultural exchange. May had begun volunteering with military families, using her experience to help others understand the impact of their actions. Yuki had perhaps changed the most dramatically. She had moved to London to study military history and was now working on a master's thesis about the role of ceremonial traditions in honoring sacrifice. Her social media presence had evolved from entertainment content to educational material that promoted understanding between cultures. The original mocking video had been taken down long ago, but their redemption story continued to inspire people. Around the world, Li Wei regularly received messages from travelers, thanking him for teaching them about respectful tourism and the importance of understanding local customs. Mrs. Mitchell had become like a grandmother to the entire group. They visited her every time they returned to London, and she had even traveled to China to meet their extended families. Her friendship had been the bridge that helped them understand not just British culture, but the universal values of honor, respect, and service. On the 1-year anniversary of their encounter, the group returned to Buckingham Palace for the changing of the guard ceremony. This time they stood respectfully silent, their behavior a perfect example of how to honor the tradition they now understood. James was on duty that day, and though he couldn't break his ceremonial composure, his eyes briefly met Li Wei's in a moment of mutual respect and friendship. The tourist who had once tried to humiliate him now stood as straight and proud as any soldier, showing the same respect for the ceremony that James himself felt. After the ceremony, they met James for lunch, continuing a friendship that had begun with conflict but had grown into something beautiful. "You know," James said as they walked through London's streets, "this whole experience taught me that sometimes the people who seem like enemies can become the greatest allies if you give them the chance to learn and grow." Liwei nodded, thinking about how much their lives had changed from that one moment of cultural insensitivity. We came to London as tourists looking for entertainment, he reflected. He left as students who had learned the most important lesson. Of our lives, that respect is a universal language that transcends all cultural boundaries. Their story had become proof that even the worst mistakes can be transformed into the most meaningful lessons, that true honor comes not from never falling, but from how gracefully you rise when you do.